They opened a 467-year-old royal coffin and couldn't believe their eyes. King Edward I, the fearsome hammer of the Scots, lay inside dressed in blood-red robes and gleaming gold. His body was almost completely intact. His crown still sat on his head. His flesh, the color of dark chocolate, showed barely any decay. When they measured him, they gasped at his towering height. But what they found clutched in his hands would reveal a secret about English coronations that had been buried for centuries. This is the shocking story of what really lies inside Westminster Abbey. On the 6th of July, 1307, King Edward I of England lay dying in a military encampment at Burgh by Sands, a remote location in Cumberland. The king had been leading his armies northward towards Scotland, preparing for yet another confrontation with Robert the Bruce. However, the journey had taken its toll. Edward had developed dysentery during the march, and his condition had deteriorated rapidly over the preceding days. When his servants entered his tent on the morning of July 7th to attend to him, they found the king in his final moments. He died in their arms that morning, bringing to an end one of the most turbulent and ambitious reigns in English history. Following established royal protocol, Edward's body was immediately prepared for the long journey back to London. The process of embalming in medieval England was quite different from modern practices. The king's body was eviscerated, with his internal organs removed, and then the corpse was carefully wrapped in cloth that had been treated with wax. This wax-soaked linen served as the primary preservative, creating a barrier that would slow decomposition during transport, and it was hoped for years to come. Once this preparation was complete, Edward's body began its somber procession southward. The funeral cortege made a temporary stop at Waltham Abbey, where the body rested before continuing to its final destination. On October 27, 1307, King Edward I was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, the traditional burial place of English monarchs. The funeral service was conducted by Bishop Anthony Beck, who held the position of Bishop of Durham, and also carried the impressive title of Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. Beck was far more than just a high-ranking clergyman performing his ceremonial duties. He had been one of Edward's closest friends and most trusted advisors throughout the king's reign. Their relationship stretched back decades, all the way to 1270, when a young Beck, then just 25 years old, had accompanied Prince Edward on crusade to the Holy Land. That shared experience of danger and devotion in the deserts of the Middle East had forged a bond that lasted until Edward's death 37 years later. Edward was buried in a location of particular significance within Westminster Abbey. His tomb was placed in the chapel of St. Edward the Confessor, situated directly behind the high altar. This chapel held special importance as it contained the shrine of the Confessor himself, the 11th century king who had been canonized as a saint and who served as England's royal patron. Edward's tomb was positioned in an arch immediately to the west of where his father, King Henry III, had been buried. Henry had been responsible for rebuilding much of Westminster Abbey in the grand Gothic style, and his own tomb reflected that grandeur. It was tall and elaborate, topped with a bronze effigy of the king, and constructed with intricate cosmati work, a decorative technique using inlaid colored stones and glass to create geometric patterns. Edward's tomb, by contrast, could hardly have been more different. Where his father's memorial was ornate and towering, Edward's was remarkably simple and understated. The tomb consists of just 5 slabs of Purbeck marble, a dark stone quarried from the Isle of Purbeck in Dorset that was popular in medieval English architecture. The design is plain and undecorated, with no effigy, no elaborate carving, and no colorful inlays. There is, however, one notable feature: an inscription carved into the north side of the tomb, the side that faces outward toward the ambulatory, the walkway that allows visitors to circulate around the Confessor's chapel. This inscription reads, Edwardus primus Scotorum malleus hic est, 1308, pactum serva. Translated into English, this means, here is Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, 1308. Keep the faith, or keep the pact. The phrase is intriguing, and has puzzled historians for centuries. The meaning of "keep the pact" remains unclear. What pact was being referenced? A promise to continue the wars against Scotland? Some agreement made at Edward's deathbed? The inscription offers no clarification, and no contemporary documents have surfaced to explain it definitively. There are also questions about when this inscription was actually carved. The most obvious problem is that it gives the wrong year for Edward's death, stating 1308 when he actually died in 1307. This error suggests the inscription may not have been contemporary with the burial itself. Many historians believe it was added much later, possibly in the middle of the 16th century during the reign of Queen Mary I. The likely candidate for adding it was Abbot John Feckenham, who led the brief restoration of the monastic community at Westminster during Mary's attempt to return England to Catholicism. The style of the lettering, painted Roman capitals, would fit with a 16th century date. However, some scholars have argued that it could be original to the tomb, pointing out that mistakes in dates were not uncommon even on contemporary monuments. Another curious aspect of the inscription is the title it gives Edward, Hammer of the Scots. This dramatic epithet has become the name most associated with Edward in popular history, conjuring images of a fierce warrior king crushing Scottish resistance. However, there is no evidence that Edward was ever called by this title during his lifetime. Contemporary chronicles and documents refer to him by other names, most commonly Longshanks, a reference to his unusual height and long legs. The Hammer of the Scots title appears to originate from this very tomb inscription, and from there, it entered into historical tradition. While the tomb appears austere today, evidence suggests it was once adorned with additional decorative elements that have since disappeared. Medieval records indicate that during coronation ceremonies, the tomb would be covered with a pall made from cloth of gold, a luxurious fabric woven with actual gold thread. An engraving published in 1701 by James Cole in a detailed guidebook to the Abbey shows the tomb surrounded by a metal railing or grille. This barrier consisted of a row of upright posts, each topped with a fleur-de-lis design, the stylized lily that served as a symbol of French royalty and was used extensively in English heraldry as well. The two outermost posts in this railing were topped with small sculpted busts that were apparently intended to represent the king himself. By the time the antiquarian John Gough wrote his comprehensive work on burial monuments, only one of these busts remained in place. The railings themselves survived until at least 1774, when they were mentioned in contemporary accounts. But at some point thereafter, they were removed and lost. There was also once a wooden canopy positioned directly above the tomb. This structure, known as a tester or canopy of honor, appears in an engraving from 1677. Historians believe this canopy may have dated from the 15th century and was likely painted in bright colors, similar to the surviving canopy over Henry III's nearby tomb. Unfortunately, this piece of history met an ignominious end. In 1764, it was torn down and destroyed to make room for the funeral procession of William Pulteney, the first Earl of Bath, a Whig politician who had briefly served as Prime Minister, and who was being buried in the Islip Chapel, on the opposite side of the ambulatory. There was also a wooden board or tablet mounted near the tomb. This board carried both a Latin inscription and an English translation, serving essentially as an extended epitaph for the king. Early antiquarians like John Weaver, who saw and transcribed it in 1631, recorded its text. By 1701, when the antiquarian William Dart examined it, the board had become very worn and difficult to read, so Dart relied on Weaver's earlier transcription. The inscription was remarkably flowery and propagandistic, praising Edward in the most glowing terms possible. It described him as a giant, fierce and mighty, who had achieved famous deeds through wisdom and military prowess. According to this text, Edward had subdued the proud through martial excellence, had been granted good fortune in Flanders, had conquered Wales, and had crushed the Scottish resistance with his armies. The inscription also presented Edward as a deeply pious man, beloved by God himself, who now enjoyed immortal bliss as a reward for his righteous life on earth. It claimed that during Edward's reign, all things had been kept in perfect order, Peace had prevailed throughout the land, and honesty had flourished. One can imagine that the Scots and Welsh might have had rather different opinions about this characterization of Edward's reign, given the devastation and suffering his wars had brought to their lands. What makes Edward's tomb particularly unusual is the treatment his body apparently received after burial. According to medieval records, the coffin was opened repeatedly over the following decades, and Edward's corpse underwent regular maintenance. Documents from the reign of Richard II, Edward's great-grandson, record orders given to the treasurer and chamberlains of the royal household to renovate the wax around Edward's body, continuing a practice that had been customary since the burial. Similar orders were issued by both Edward III and Henry IV. No other medieval English king received such treatment, with the sole exception of those who had been recognized as saints. The wax being renovated was almost certainly the wax-soaked cloth that formed the primary layer of preservation around the body. There has long been a tradition, though many modern historians consider it probably legendary, that Edward had expressed specific wishes about what should happen to his body after death. According to these stories, he wanted his heart removed and carried to the Holy Land, and he supposedly requested that his body be taken from the grave periodically and carried with the English army on every military campaign against Scotland. The removal of hearts for burial in distant locations was indeed a common practice among medieval nobility, so that part of the story is plausible. The idea of carrying around a corpse on military campaigns seems rather less practical, though not entirely impossible given medieval attitudes toward relics and the bodies of important individuals. Perhaps the regular care given to Edward's corpse and the relatively simple construction of his tomb, which could be easily dismantled and reassembled, were intended to allow for the fulfillment of these wishes if the need ever arose. We will never know with certainty what Edward's actual deathbed instructions were. What we do know from the historical record is that despite all these stories and preparations, Edward's body does not appear to have ever left Westminster Abbey, once it was placed in the tomb in October of 1307. In 1770, a lawyer and fellow of the Society of Antiquaries named Daines Barrington became increasingly fascinated by the medieval documentary references to the regular maintenance and wax renovation of King Edward I's body. These unusual historical records, which mention the repeated opening of the royal coffin and the treatment of the corpse, were unlike anything associated with other English monarchs. Barrington was determined to discover what exactly these documents meant and what condition Edward's body might be in after more than 460 years in the tomb. He began a persistent campaign to convince the Dean and Chapter of Westminster Abbey to grant permission for the tomb to be opened and examined. The Dean and Chapter, understandably cautious about disturbing the resting place of a medieval king, took their time considering this unusual request. It was not until 4 years later, in 1774, that they finally agreed to allow the examination to proceed. On the 2nd of May that year, in the presence of witnesses and with proper documentation being prepared, the tomb of King Edward I was carefully opened for the first time since the medieval period. Sir Joseph Aloff, another fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, was present at the opening and subsequently gave a detailed account of the proceedings to the society. To ensure that there would be a permanent visual record of this extraordinary event, the artist William Blake was commissioned to be present. Blake, who would later become famous as both a poet and painter, was at this time still establishing his reputation as an engraver and illustrator. He created a series of careful drawings documenting what was found inside the tomb, and these drawings are now preserved in the collection of the Society of Antiquaries of London, providing us with an invaluable visual record of the tomb's contents. The first discovery came when the workmen attempted to remove the lid of the tomb. They found that it was not actually fixed or cemented to the rest of the monument in any way. The massive stone lid was simply resting on top of the tomb chest, held in place only by its own considerable weight. This was an unusual construction detail for a royal tomb, and it seemed to support the historical accounts of repeated openings. If the tomb had needed to be accessed regularly for the maintenance of the king's body, having a lid that could be lifted off without having to break mortar or damage the structure would have been essential. Once the lid was removed, those present could see inside the tomb chest itself. Lying within, surrounded by a layer of small rubble and debris that had accumulated over the centuries, was a stone coffin. This inner coffin was made of Purbeck marble, the same dark stone used for the tomb chest itself, and it had been smoothly finished. When measured, it was found to be 6 feet and 7 inches in length. The coffin had a lid that was 3 inches thick, and both the coffin and its lid were covered on the outside with a layer of yellowish varnish. Some observers at the time speculated that this varnish might be the deteriorated remains of gold leaf that had once covered the coffin, though this could not be confirmed with certainty. The moment when the coffin lid was lifted must have been extraordinary for Barrington, Alof, and the other antiquarians present. They had no way of knowing what condition the body would be in after so many centuries, or whether the medieval embalming techniques and subsequent wax renovations would have preserved anything at all. What they discovered exceeded their expectations. The first thing visible was that the entire corpse had been wrapped in what they described as a strong, coarse linen cloth arranged in a square mantle shape. This outer covering had been treated with wax on the underside, the surface that was in direct contact with the king's body. The cloth ran underneath the body and then folded over the front, though it did not completely cover the corpse. In the drawing that William Blake made of this moment, you can clearly see the top of the king's head, with a crown still in place, visible above the edge of this waxed cloth. This waxed linen was almost certainly the material that had been replaced and renovated so many times during the medieval period. When this protective cloth was carefully pulled back, the full extent of the preservation became apparent. Covering the king's face was a piece of red silk cloth, though this delicate fabric had mostly deteriorated by 1774. Blake's drawing shows it in a fragmented state, barely clinging to the features beneath. What lay under this silk veil was remarkable. The body of King Edward I was, as the antiquarians recorded, almost entire. It had undergone very little decomposition. Instead, the flesh had simply dried out over the centuries, becoming what Alof described as a dry brown color, something like chocolate. The body had shrunk somewhat, as might be expected, but the basic structure and form remained intact. One of the first things the observers did was to measure the body. From head to foot, King Edward measured 6 feet and 2 inches in height. This was a remarkable stature for a medieval man, when the average height was considerably shorter than it is today. This measurement confirmed that the nickname by which Edward had been known during his lifetime, Longshanks, was entirely appropriate. He had indeed been a man of exceptional height, with notably long legs. Beneath the outer waxed cloth covering, the body had been wrapped in an inner layer of wax-treated linen. This wrapping covered most of the torso, but left the lower arms and hands exposed. Over this inner shroud, Edward had been dressed in an elaborate set of ceremonial robes that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with royal coronations. The innermost visible garment was a tunic made of red silk damask, a luxurious fabric with a woven pattern. Over this tunic, crossed over the chest in the manner that a priest would wear it, was an embroidered stole. This stole was worked with gold thread and decorated with what the 18th century observers believed were glass or paste gemstones, along with hundreds of tiny beads resembling pearls. The outermost layer of clothing was a mantle of crimson satin, a rich red cloak that covered the upper body. This mantle was fastened at the side with a brooch made of gilded metal, which was also studded with imitation precious stones. From the waist down, the entire lower portion of the king's body was covered with a piece of cloth of gold, that expensive fabric woven with real gold thread, that had also been mentioned in connection with the palls used to cover the tomb during coronations. This combination of garments is fascinating because it represents exactly the same sequence of robes that British monarchs still wear today during their coronation ceremonies. Though, of course, the specific garments used in modern coronations are not these medieval originals. The innermost tunic that Edward wore is known in the coronation ceremony as the super tunica. Over this, the monarch wears a stole, just as Edward did. This stole is significant because it is a garment associated with priests, and its inclusion in the coronation robe symbolizes that the sovereign has a quasi-priestly role, serving as the head of the Church of England and having a sacred dimension to their office. The outermost garment is the royal mantle, the great ceremonial cloak that represents the full majesty of kingship. In addition to these robes, Edward's body was accompanied by items of funeral regalia, replica versions of the coronation insignia made from gilded copper, rather than precious metals and jewels. On his head was a narrow band or circlet of gilt copper, decorated with trefoil shapes. This represented the crown. In his right hand was a scepter, approximately 2.5 feet in length, topped with a cross. In his left hand was a much longer rod, about 5 feet in length, surmounted by a dove that still retained traces of green enamel decoration. These items are particularly significant because they appear to be copies of the actual coronation regalia that was kept at Westminster Abbey and associated with St. Edward the Confessor. To this day, during coronation ceremonies, the British sovereign is invested with a shorter scepter topped with a cross and a longer rod topped with a dove. The versions used today are 17th century replacements for medieval originals that were destroyed during the English Civil War and the Commonwealth period. However, Edward I's funeral regalia, created in the early 14th century, likely replicated the actual medieval confessor's regalia that was in use at the time. Edward I appears to have been the first English king to be invested during his coronation with the regalia that had belonged to St. Edward the Confessor. His father, Henry III, had been responsible for retrieving these sacred objects from the confessor's tomb and establishing them as the official coronation regalia of England. The scepter and rod found in Edward's coffin therefore probably give us our best indication of what the original confessor's regalia looked like before those items were lost to history. When the examination was completed in 1774, nothing was removed from King Edward's coffin. The observers carefully documented and drew everything they had found, but they did not take samples or souvenirs. The body, still dressed in its coronation robes and surrounded by its funeral regalia, was left exactly as it had been found. The coffin was sealed again, the tomb lid was replaced, and Edward I was returned to the darkness and silence he had occupied for nearly 5 centuries. He remains there still, lying in his austere Purbeck marble tomb in the chapel of St. Edward the Confessor at Westminster Abbey, wrapped in waxed linen and dressed in the magnificent robes he wore at his coronation more than 700 years ago. The tomb that appears so plain and simple from the outside contains within it one of the most remarkably preserved medieval royal burials in existence, a time capsule of early 14th century kingship frozen in stone and silk.